You land at a mid-size American airport with 2 checked bags, a carry-on stuffed with instant noodles your mother insisted you'd need, and a tuition bill that costs more than your parents' house. That's not a metaphor. You do the math on the ride from the airport. The semester rate alone, somewhere between $17,000 and $30,000, depending on whether you're at a flagship state school or a private university with a chapel older than your country's constitution, would cover a decade of education back home. And that's just tuition. There's a mandatory health insurance fee, a technology fee, an international student fee, which is its own kind of poetry, a surcharge for the privilege of being from somewhere else. There's an orientation fee for a 3-hour session where someone in a lanyard explains what a social security number is and reminds you that jaywalking is technically illegal. Your total cost of attendance for the year lands somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000. You do not qualify for federal financial aid. You do not qualify for state grants. You do not qualify for subsidized loans. You qualify for the full sticker price, paid up front or wired in installments from a foreign bank account your family opened specifically for this purpose. The admissions brochure called it an investment in your future. Your father called it the plan. Your mother, who sold jewelry she'd been saving since her wedding to close the gap on your first deposit, called it nothing at all. You are one of over 1 million international students currently enrolled in the United States, and collectively, you contribute north of $40 billion a year to the American economy. You are a revenue engine dressed in a backpack. Universities don't say that out loud, of course. They say global campus. They say diverse perspectives. They say cross-cultural exchange. But the math says something simpler. You pay 2 to 3 times what the kid sitting next to you in Econ 101 pays, and you do it without complaint, because complaining might jeopardize the one thing keeping you in the country. A thin paper document called an I-20, attached to a visa status so fragile that a dropped class could technically end the whole thing. Welcome to America. You are here to learn. You are also here to fund. 1. The system. Nobody explains until you've already signed. The F-1 visa is a masterpiece of conditional generosity. It says, you may live here, you may study here, you may not work here, except on campus, for up to 20 hours a week, at jobs that pay somewhere between minimum wage and spiritual damage. You can shelve library books, you can swipe IDs at the dining hall, you can tutor other students in a subject you already mastered 2 years ago in your home country. But you cannot work at the coffee shop across the street, you cannot freelance, you cannot drive for a rideshare. You cannot do the thing every other struggling student around you does to survive, because your visa says the only acceptable version of you is the one sitting in a lecture hall. Your parents are sending money from a country where the exchange rate turns every wire transfer into a small funeral. They sell land. They refinance. They borrow from uncles who pretend it isn't a loan. And you sit in a dorm room that costs $14,000 a year, eating rice you cooked in a contraband rice cooker, wondering whether the fire alarm will go off again because your roommate from Connecticut microwaved fish sticks at midnight. You learn the system fast. You learn that full-time enrollment means 12 credits minimum, and dropping below that threshold means you've violated your status. You learn that changing your major requires paperwork through the international office. You learn that transferring schools means getting a new I-20, and that a gap in enrollment, even a brief one, can be interpreted as a breach. You learn that the entire architecture of your legal presence in this country is built on continuous compliance with a bureaucracy that does not send reminders, does not forgive easily, and does not care that you had a panic attack during finals week. You learn, in other words, that freedom in America is a subscription service, and your plan doesn't include most of the features. 2. The social math. The first semester is a study in invisible accounting, not just financial, though that never stops, but social. You are constantly calculating what things cost in ways your American classmates never have to. A group wants to go to a restaurant downtown. You check the menu online first, not for dietary reasons, but because $19 for a chicken sandwich plus tax plus tip plus the Uber split means you've just spent $32 on a meal your mother could have made for 3. You go anyway, because saying no 3 times in a row turns you into the person who never comes, and being the person who never comes is a loneliness you can't afford either. So you spend the money and laugh at the right moments and split the check evenly even though you only ordered water and an appetizer, because explaining the math out loud would feel worse than absorbing it in silence. Your American friends have part-time jobs. They bartend, they tutor on apps, they sell clothes online, they have Venmo balances and credit card points, and parents who transfer grocery money on the first of every month. You have a campus job swiping cards at the gym for $11 an hour, 20 hours a week, which after taxes comes to roughly $800 a month, in a country where your rent alone is $700 if you're lucky enough to have found a place off campus. The math doesn't math, it never does. But you make it work by cooking in bulk, skipping the social events that require a cover charge, and treating yourself to a $6 iced coffee once a week like it's a religious observance. Nobody tells you that the loneliest part of being an international student isn't the distance from home. It's the constant, low-grade performance of being fine. You are fine when your roommate's parents visit and take everyone to brunch. You are fine when a classmate complains that their parents are only paying for tuition, not rent. You are fine when someone asks what your parents do, and you give a vague answer because the truth, that your father is a mid-level civil servant who cashed out his pension to get you here, doesn't translate into a conversation that ends comfortably. You build a second social life with other international students. Not because you're cliquish, but because they're the only people who understand the weight of a $3 laundry cycle. You share groceries, you share textbooks, you share immigration lawyers' names the way Americans share Netflix passwords. You develop a shorthand for the things that are too exhausting to keep explaining: visa anxiety, wire transfer delays, the uniquely destabilizing experience of watching your country's currency drop against the dollar in real time and realizing your next semester just got 15% more expensive. You are not homesick exactly, you are system sick. Tired of navigating a country that invited you in and then made every next step feel like a toll road. 3. The op-ed clock. You graduate. You walk across a stage in a rented gown and your parents watch on a video call at 3 in the morning their time, and for one brief moment, the investment feels worth it. Then the clock starts. Optional Practical Training, OPT, 12 months of work authorization, or up to 36 if your degree is in a qualifying STEM field. This is your window. Your one shot to convert 4 years of tuition payments and cultural adjustment and fire alarm rice cooking into an actual American career. You apply for your employment authorization document. It takes 3 to 5 months to arrive. During that waiting period, you cannot legally work, so you sit in the apartment you can barely afford, refreshing your USCIS case status like it's a stock ticker, while your American classmates start jobs, sign leases, set up 401ks, and begin lives that were never conditional on a government processing time. The card arrives. You start working. The job is good, maybe even great. You're doing what you studied for, in the country you studied in, and for the first time in 4 years, the numbers start to make a kind of sense. You're earning. You're building. You're contributing to Social Security and Medicare, programs you may never benefit from depending on how the next few years go. But you pay in anyway, because the system doesn't offer an opt-out for people whose futures here are still hypothetical. And now, the real game begins. The H-1B visa. 85,000 spots a year, 65,000 for the regular cap, 20,000 for U.S. master's degree holders. Your employer has to sponsor you. They have to register you in the annual lottery, which now, as of the 2027 fiscal year season, isn't even random anymore. It's wage-weighted. The government assigns you a number of entries based on how much your job pays relative to Labor Department wage data. Higher salary, more lottery entries, better odds. If you're entry level, which most new graduates are, your odds just got worse. The overall selection rate has hovered around 20 to 22% in recent cycles, which means there's roughly a 4 in 5 chance that the next chapter of your American life comes down to a bureaucratic coin flip you don't even get to watch. If you're selected, you file a petition. Your employer pays filing fees, $460 base, plus a $500 fraud fee, plus $750 to $1,500 more depending on company size. If you're unlucky enough to be abroad during the process, there's a new $100,000 proclamation fee your employer may have to pay. If you're not selected, you try again next year. And if your OPT runs out before you're selected, you leave. Not because you failed, not because you weren't good enough, but because a random number generator said no, and the system that educated you for $250,000 has no backup plan for keeping you. you start to understand what America really means when it says merit-based immigration. It means the merit is real, but the mechanism is a slot machine. 4. The quiet bargain. There's a version of this story nobody posts on LinkedIn. The version where you're lying in bed at 1 a.m. doing the math on whether it's cheaper to fly home for a funeral or send flowers in a video message. The version where you miss your best friend's wedding because leaving the country while your status is pending could trigger a re-entry problem you can't afford to risk. The version where your younger sibling asks when you're coming back and you say soon, which is a word that stopped meaning anything 2 years ago. You are building a life in a country that hasn't decided whether it wants you yet. You pay taxes, you file returns, you contribute to a local economy, rent, groceries, gas, insurance, the $8 oat milk latte you buy when you need to feel like a person and not a case number. You do everything a citizen does except vote, collect unemployment, or relax. Your American co-workers talk about work-life balance like it's a human right. For you, work is life, because without the job, there is no visa, and without the visa, there is no life. Not here, anyway. You become fluent in a language they don't teach in any university. The language of contingency. Every plan has an asterisk. Every lease is signed with the quiet knowledge that you might not be here to finish it. You don't buy furniture that's too heavy to leave behind. You don't adopt a dog because what happens to the dog if you get a denial letter in March? You date carefully because explaining to someone that your ability to remain in the country depends on an annual government lottery is not exactly first date energy. Some people understand. Most people nod politely and change the subject. A few say, "Can't you just, apply for a green card?" Which is a little like asking someone stuck in traffic whether they've considered simply arriving. The green card, the great American dangling carrot. If you're lucky enough to have an employer willing to sponsor you, the process begins with a labor certification, then a petition, then an adjustment of status, a pipeline that can take anywhere from 2 years to 2 decades depending on your country of birth. If you were born in India, the backlog for an employment-based green card stretches past your expected retirement. You could work in America for 30 years, pay taxes for 30 years, raise American children for 30 years, and still technically be pending. The system doesn't reject you. It just never quite finishes saying yes. And through all of this, you keep performing. You perform gratitude, because complaining about the country that gave you an opportunity feels ungrateful, even when the opportunity came with a price tag that would make a mortgage broker wince. You perform calm because showing frustration with the immigration system makes people uncomfortable, and uncomfortable people don't sponsor visas. You perform belonging because the alternative, admitting out loud that you've spent $150,000 to live in a state of permanent uncertainty, is a thought too heavy to hold for more than a few seconds at a time. You are not a guest. You are not a citizen. You are something the system never built a word for, a person who bet everything on a country that keeps you on red. 5. The dream, adjusted for inflation. Here is what nobody told you at the airport. The American dream is real. It's just not free and it's not guaranteed, and the terms and conditions are written in a font size that requires a lawyer and a magnifying glass, and a tolerance for ambiguity that borders on spiritual practice. You came here because the degree meant something, because the name on the diploma opened doors that didn't exist where you were, because your parents believed, with a faith that embarrasses you now in its purity, that America was the place where effort converted directly into outcome. And in some ways, they were right. You did learn. You did grow. You did become someone who can navigate 2 tax systems, 3 languages, and a bureaucracy that treats you like a number on Tuesdays and a valued contributor on hiring brochures. But the conversion rate was never 1-to-1. For every door that opened, there was a form. For every opportunity, a condition. For every welcome, a quiet footnote that read, subject to continued eligibility, employer sponsorship, annual lottery selection, and the prevailing political mood of a country that changes its mind about immigrants every 4 to 8 years. You look at the international students arriving now, younger, wide-eyed, dragging the same 2 suitcases, and you want to say something honest, not discouraging, just honest. That this country will teach you more than any classroom. That the loneliness sharpens you. That the bureaucracy either breaks you or turns you into the most organized person in any room. That you will eat meals alone and fill out forms at midnight and wire money in directions that stop making sense. that you will love this place and resent it in the same breath, sometimes in the same sentence. That the dream is not a lie. It's just priced like everything else in America, aggressively, with hidden fees, and with a refund policy that doesn't exist. You are still here. Maybe on a visa, maybe on a prayer, maybe on a green card that arrived 11 years after you applied. You are still converting currency and code switching and calculating whether the iced coffee is worth it today. You are still doing the math, and the math, if you're being honest, has never once added up. But you keep doing it anyway, because somewhere between the tuition wire and the lottery notification and the 3 a.m. video call home, you became the kind of person who doesn't quit just because the numbers don't make sense. That's not the American dream. That's the international student version. Same dream, triple the tuition, no guarantee of residency. So yeah, you paid 6 figures to find out that freedom has a processing time. Subscribe for more American dreams sold at full international markup.